Actually specialize in internal, external, and wireless assessments, and for me, I really enjoy the internal Active Directory type assessments and wireless, which is why I'm giving this talk today. Before that, I was a software engineer. I'm doing reverse engineering of embedded.
One sec, they're not getting any audio.
I know, it's coming.
Is it fixed? Okay.
Okay.
Could you perhaps like TLDR the last 2 minutes of that talk?
Yeah, I suck at web apps. I'm a pen tester, and before that, I did some reverse engineering of embedded devices, and that's where I kind of first got the intro to the black magic that is RF. And basically, I'm just a curious noob who likes to break things. I literally break almost everything I touch, so there's that. But for this talk, a quick overview, we'll be discussing just a brief introduction of some Wi-Fi terms and some specifications, and then go over a timeline of Wi-Fi security and some cryptography, and then get into some demos and wireless network attacks, and then end with some takeaways and recommendations. And as a brief disclaimer, this presentation and tutorials are for educational purposes only. So we'll begin with a really high-level brief primer of some terminology to get started. So the Wi-Fi specifications were derived from the IEEE standard 802.1x or 802.11. And as you can see, there are several standards listed below. The 802.1 or 802.11a and AC networks both operate on the 5 gigahertz bands as well as the IN network as well, whereas the 802.11b and G both operate on the 2.4 gigahertz frequency ranges. And the biggest difference between these standards is the frequency that they do operate on. And the main difference between the 2.4 gigahertz and the 5 gigahertz bands is going to be the speed and distance, essentially, of your Wi-Fi coverage. So with a 2.4 gigahertz band network, you're going to have slower speeds, but the overall distance or coverage of your network is going to cover a lot more just area of where your access point is located. Whereas a 5 gigahertz band is going to give you a lot faster speeds, but the coverage of where you can access that network is going to be a lot smaller. And with the 2.4 gigahertz band, it consists of 11 channels, 8 of which overlap. So channels 1, 6, and 11 are commonly used in this configuration because these channels do not overlap. And the 5 gigahertz band consists of 45 channels, and it has a lot less overlap, with 24 out of the 45 channels do not overlap. So there's a lot less interference with that band. Some other terms we should be familiar with is the extended service set identifier or the network name. So if we look at the image in the center, we have our classic kind of home setup with our wireless access point in the middle. And so starting from top to bottom, we see the ESSID is Acme Corp Guest. The next term we should know is the BSSID or Basic Service Set Identifier. This is often referred to as the hardware address or MAC address. And then underneath that, we can see the encryption type of the network, which is WPA2, which we'll cover in a second, -PSK. And PSK stands for pre-shared key, and this is also referred to as the Wi-Fi passphrase or password used to connect to the network. To the right of the image, we can see 3 devices or 3 clients that are connected to the wireless access point, and their corresponding MAC addresses or BSSIDs listed beneath those clients as well. So get into a bit of the timeline of wireless security. So as wireless networks have evolved, the Wi-Fi Alliance has developed several security protocols to help improve wireless network security. And so in 1999, we have WEP, or wired equivalent privacy, which hopefully we're not seeing too many networks configured with this today, as this was deprecated in 2004. This protocol uses the RC4 cipher, which we know is vulnerable to analytical attacks, and this is because the initialization vector, which is used as part of this encryption algorithm, is actually set in the clear. So this is very weak and insecure, and hopefully not seen today in 2021. And in 2003, the Wi-Fi protected access first iteration was developed, and this overall still had pretty weak security. It still used the RC4 cipher, but tried to make it a little bit better with the temporal key integrity protocol. And WPA supports both pre-shared key using of a password to authenticate to the network, along with support for 802.1x with EAP variants for authentication. And this is often referred to as WPA Enterprise. The transition from WEP to WPA was pretty seamless and only required firmware upgrades, whereas going from WPA to WPA2 or WPA2 to 3 is going to require both firmware upgrades and hardware upgrades to support these protocols. So in 2004, WPA2, the second iteration, was released, which is stronger than the first one and uses AES instead of RC4. And we still have support for the PSK and the WPA Enterprise variant as well. And in 2018, we have WPA3. And this, again, is just getting better with cryptography and uses AES 128 and 196-bit encryption keys for the pre-shared key and the enterprise configurations, respectively. And for the pre-shared key portion of this authentication, it actually uses, for WPA3, it uses simultaneous authentication of equals. So for that method, for what that means for us as an attacker, whenever we do our pre-shared key attacks trying to capture that handshake and do the brute force attack, this is going to be making this a lot harder for us just due to the advanced protocol being used there. But we still have the enterprise support and EAP variants as well with this protocol. I personally haven't seen too many networks configured with WPA3, but that's probably because just the hardware upgrades and it's just taking a long time. I mean, we can see even with software, right? Like people aren't upgrading. So if you're adding hardware components to it, again, just all the device supports and just hardship of rolling them all out, it's just going to take a little while. So just kind of keep that in mind whenever you see that. But it does cause some challenges with WPA3 and pre-shared key configurations. So now that we have a basic understanding of some of the Wi-Fi terms we should be familiar with, let's get into some of the Wi-Fi hacking methodology. So we're first going to start with OSINT, or first discovery and reconnaissance, and discover the wireless networks that are around us, along with their configurations. From there, we can perform traffic analysis and do specific like network targeting and figure out, how active is this network. And then from there, we can actually start attacking the specific targeted network that we, of course, have permission to attack. So there are a few different kinds of wireless network attacks depending on how the wireless network is configured. And so if it's configured with the WPA or WPA2 pre-shared key, meaning using a password for authentication, we can capture that four-way handshake that's used whenever a user tries to connect to a network and potentially recover that password ourselves. We can also do a deauthentication attack to help speed up this process whenever capturing that four-way handshake. And then there's also evil twin attacks and rogue access points that can be used to attack enterprise networks or networks with more advanced configurations where we can actually set up a fake access point, use a captive portal, or mimic a known network to try to get people to authenticate to us and perform a man-in-the-middle attack. So some tools that we'll need for this include a wireless network card that supports monitor mode and packet injection. And I have a couple examples here of the Alpha ACH model and along with the Hack5 Pineapple. And also a Linux operating system of choice. I will be performing the demos in Cali. And the main tools that we'll be using and that I use for most of my assessments are the AirCrack G Suite along with EAP Hammer from GitHub. And we will only be scratching the surface of EAP Hammer today, but I highly, oh, sorry.
You're talking screaming fast.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I'll slow down a little bit. Thank you. You can tell I haven't given many talks before. Just a little nervous. Thanks. So yeah, we're only going to scratch the surface today with EAP Hammer in setting up a evil access point, but it can do so many different things from setting up a captive portal, actually doing the pre-shared key captures as well, and just numerous other things that I actually need to dig more into the tool myself. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with our first demo. Oh, sorry. Before we get into that demo, I first want to show you a picture of what that four-way handshake looks like. And so the important thing to know here is that the master key is derived from the pre-shared key or password when entered to connect to the network. And so from there, the device and the access point perform this four-way handshake that you see here. And so an attacker can eavesdrop on that four-way handshake and then try to brute force and recover that pre-shared key from this capture. And so this one will actually be a recorded demo for this portion. So our target network is going to be Acme Corp Guest. And from the screenshot here, this is just from me putting my alpha card into monitor mode. And so I just ran arrow dump ng and my wireless card. And so from there, we can see the list of networks that are around us. And so a couple things to point out here. From the screenshot, you can see the first couple of networks that are listed. The ESSID has a linked colon of 0. And basically what this means is that these networks are hidden or that the access point is not broadcasting the network name. And so this is essentially security through obscurity to prevent just the network name being blasted. It's very easy to recover that name yourself without even authenticating to the network because people have to connect to the network and send the network name somewhere in those broadcast messages. So it's very easy to recover it, but that's just a note there. And our target network is going to be Acme Corp Guest, which from left to right, we can see the BSSID listed to the left. It's operating on channel 6 and using the encryption type of WPA2, and the auth type is PSK or pre-shared key, which is what we expect. So I have a screenshot of that up here because we will need some of that information when performing this attack. So I think this is going to play. So yeah, I'll first run IWconfig to see that my wireless card is being picked up by Kali, and we can see it's in managed mode. So from there, we first want to put our device into monitor mode, and we can do that by using the airmon-ng, which is part of that tool suite I mentioned previously. So we can put our device into monitor mode by running airmon-ng start with the wireless name, and then see that it was enabled, and just reconfirming with IWconfig that our device has been put into monitor mode. So this is normally where you'd run arrow dump to see the networks that are around you. I had already done that ahead of time. So we can actually use arrow dump to narrow in on our specific wireless network as well that we want to target. So I'm going to do that now on the bottom of the screen by specifying the channel, which at the top we can see as 6, the MAC address of the network that we want to target, and then a file to write our pre-shared key captured handshake to, and then the device that we're using for this attack. So you can see once I launch this, we can see that there's one client connected to the network. Normally there will be a lot more connected to an access point. This is just a proof of concept demo. I only had one device connected at the time. So this is basically where you just sit and wait and hope somebody else connects to the network so we can capture that four-way handshake. Or, like I mentioned before during the methodology, we can actually perform a deauthorization attack against a client that's already on the network in the hopes that they reconnect and we can capture that process once they reestablish connection to the network again. So in the second terminal, I think this is going to go now. Okay. I'm going to do that deauth attack over here using air replay and specify the attack for deauth, and I'm going to send 10 deauthorization packets with this command. You want to keep this number pretty low because, again, we are kicking the user off the network momentarily, and so if we set this to a high number, that's essentially a denial of service. So we just want to do this momentarily to capture that four-way handshake, and we will need the MAC address of the access point and then the MAC address of the client that we want to target and kick off the network, along with our interface name. So once I hit enter here, you can see the deauth packets being sent on the right, and then on the left, in the lost column, we can see the number of packets jump up quite a bit, and that was because we were sending those packets and making all of that traffic be lost for that client that's actually on the network. So we didn't get that handshake, so I went ahead and reran that attack one more time. And up at the top right, you can see that we were able to capture the handshake that time for the network. And so from here, we can use the same suite of tools and use AirCrackNG to try to crack the password for this pre-shared key using a word list that we specify. So I'm going to use the Rocky word list that I just added the simple Wi-Fi password to. And so all we need here is the MAC address of the access point, along with the word list that we want to use for our brute force attack. And I'm specifying the Rocky word list here, and our captured file that we just captured our 4-way handshake. And so depending on how strong or weak the password is, ours is pretty weak. You can see in the middle there, Star Wars Star is the password for Acme Corp Guest Network. So from here, we found it pretty quick. If the password was stronger, it would take longer, or if the word list didn't have that word in it, it wouldn't have cracked, of course. So depending on your word list and how much time an attacker has, we can actually recover the plain text password to connect to the network, and essentially now connect as we were a regular user to this network. And so now I can do connection to the internet and start browsing anything just like a normal user would connect to this network. We had talked previously about the WPA Enterprise and support for EAP variants. So this was that second kind of configuration that is supported. This WPA Enterprise was another enhancement in wireless configuration for WPA and WPA2 type networks. Extensible Authentication Protocol, or EAP, is essentially a framework that provides common functions and negotiation of authentication methods called EAP methods. And there's currently about 40 different EAP methods defined. However, we're only going to cover 3 of those today, which are the most common configurations for wireless networks. And those are protected EAP, EAP TTLS, and EAP TLS. And with the WPA Enterprise configuration, this uses a radius server for authentication, and that's where these EAP methods are configured. So some common EAP methods that are seen in the real world, both PEEP and EAP TTLS are the ones seen most common in just configured enterprise networks, and both of these are actually pretty common. They are both proprietary and tunneled, meaning that the information sent between the client and the radius server, seen down here on the bottom, is protected with a TLS tunnel, and then another inner authentication method is used to actually send those credentials. Both of these methods also only require certificates on the server side, and the client is optional. And we'll see why there's issues with those configurations in a few slides. And EAP TLS isn't seen as often, and that's probably because the deployment difficulties are pretty hard. It enforces certificates on both the client and server side, so just rolling these out and maintaining this kind of configuration is pretty difficult overall. So it's not really seen in a lot of client networks. Some of the EAP inner authentication methods that you may see include EAP MS-Chat v2 or Microsoft's Challenge Handshake Authentication Protocol version 2. This protocol uses weak DES encryption, which is vulnerable to brute force attacks. And with this protocol, we can potentially recover the net NTLM-v1 password hash of users whenever they connect to the network. And as the name suggests, with it being Microsoft, this is probably, it is used whenever on Windows operating systems whenever they're connected. So just think any Windows device when connecting to the network, for the most part, you're going to be seeing this protocol in use for enterprise networks. EAP GTC, or generic token card, was an alternative to MS-Chat v2 created by Cisco. And this actually exchanges authentication credentials over the network in clear text. So if we're able to man in the middle of this, we can potentially recover clear text usernames and passwords. And the generic token card method is mainly used for like smart devices and like your iPad, phone, stuff like that. These devices don't support the more advanced challenge handshake type protocols, so most of them fall back to this generic token card method. So how do these attacks happen in real life? As I mentioned before, PEEP and EAP TTLS both do not enforce certificates on the client side, meaning both of these methods are vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attacks. So an attacker can create a fake certificate and spoof the real access point, and this is very hard or difficult to detect on the client or user side. And due to your Wi-Fi speed and connection, depending on how close you are to the access point or the network, your wireless device will connect basically to the access point with the strongest signal. And if your device recognizes a network that it has seen before, it basically is marked that network as known or trusted. So if we look at the diagram that we have here, we have an attacker sitting outside a coffee shop. The coffee shop has free Wi-Fi and the network name is free Wi-Fi. We have an attacker sitting outside, then they've also created a fake access point with the same name, and the victim is closer to the attacker than the coffee shop's access point. So if the victim had already connected to this access point before, instead it would connect to the attacker since the attacker is sitting in closer proximity than the actual access point. All right, so we can now move to the Evil Twin Attack demo. I have a screenshot here. I'm going to try to do this live. Hopefully everything is working again. Our target network here is Acme Corp, and it's going to be configured with WPA2 Enterprise. And I have all of this configured on my Wi-Fi Pineapple here, and the tool that we're going to be using again for the setting up the actual access point will be EAP Hammer. So let's see. All right. So I have that. All right. So we're first going to run iwconfig. Make sure that, so we can see my wireless card is being detected by Kali, and it is in managed mode right now. I can go to my, my other VM. I don't know why this isn't going. So if I come over here to my other VM, we can see that Acme Corp is here. And so before I set up the evil access point, we can already see that network is active. So I first want to put my device into monitor mode. Airmon NG start, and then my wireless network card name. So we can see there that monitor mode has been enabled, and rerun iwconfig to see that. And so we first want to see the networks that are around us. If I can type, aerodump-ng. And so we just specify our wireless name. Well, it's taken a while. I'm basically just waiting for to see the Acme Corp network pop up here, but it's taken a minute. Okay then. I don't know why I can't see it. Interesting. right, part one of demo gods coming for me. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and clear that. We can pretend that we saw the network from there. So if I go, I don't want to go back to the slide, but I'm going to copy the same information. So instead of having the same screenshot like I had shown before, we essentially just want to discover the networks that are around us, and I want to target Acme Corp. And from before, we saw that it was operating on channel 11, and then that encryption type being MGT specified that it was an enterprise network. So instead of doing the discovery over there, I'll show you setting up the Evil Twin access point. So I have EAP Hammer installed over here on the right. And it has a really great feature. The way to basically set up access points before, you had to do a lot of stuff manually, configuring your host APD file. EAP Hammer has a lot of this built into just a command line type tool that's really easy to use. So we can first configure a certificate for our enterprise network that we want to spoof for our access point by doing cert wizard. And so once we run this, it's going to ask us a series of questions, basically for configuration of the certificate itself. And we want all of this information to be as accurate as possible. We can even copy the legitimate cert that we're trying to clone as well. So I'm going to make it all match like Acme Corp, since that's the fake corp that we're attacking here. So we can do like Acme Corp IT, and do like Acme IT, acmecorp.com. All right, so once it creates a certificate, it writes it out to a file for us. And so from there, we can go ahead and use EAP Hammer to actually stand up our fake access point. So I'm going to do that by specifying a few flags. First, we want our interface that we're going to be using to stand up our access point, which is WLAN 0. I actually want to make sure this is stopped. Okay, so I turned off monitor mode over there. EAP Hammer takes care of that automatically. Also specify the network that we want to spoof, which is Acme Corp. Specify the same channel as the network that we're targeting, which is channel 11. The authorization type is WPA EAP. Whoops, tac off. WPA version is 2. And these are basically just the flags from the network configuration, and it's going to stand up a access point with the same exact configuration, just a different MAC address for the target network. And then specify tac creds for credential theft. Oops, I can type today. There we go. So if all goes well, we can see our access point was enabled here. And just as a quick OPSEC note, I did not specify my hardware identifier for my fake access point, so it went with the default of 012340, which is not really great if somebody's actually paying attention. But for the most part, users won't see that. But just keep that in mind when setting this up as well. Okay. Oh, well, I can't see anything over here. I think it's because it like moves just a tiny bit.
You can't see anything on your monitor?
Well, I had it like in extended mode, so it was. There you go. Cool. So we can see our access point has been enabled. So I'll first go and show you the Windows authentication. If I can find my VM again. So if I come back over here to my Windows machine, this is a domain joined machine for my local lab that I have set up here. So if I go ahead and connect to this network, we can see some events triggering over an EAP hammer. Sometimes it doesn't allow you to connect on the first try, but most users know Wi-Fi just doesn't really work all the time, so they're going to try and try again. So I can first try to authenticate using my Windows password. I've also seen hit or miss with this as well for access points, so we can see if this is going to work. We can see some stuff happened over an EAP hammer, but we didn't actually get the credentials come across. So try this one more time. All right, so this is really all a user gets when connecting to a network over here. So this is why I was saying whenever setting up those configurations for your certificate, you want to make it look as realistic as possible. Because if the user gets this pop-up, they can hit show more information, and you can see all the information that I specified for EAP Hammer is configured there. So we can see the name, who it was issued to, and issued by. So if this was all just, I'm going to hack you, whatever, most people are going to be like, that doesn't really look right. But this one looks legit. We'll go ahead and connect to it. So the user, unfortunately, doesn't get Wi-Fi access. We, in return, though, get their net and TLM hash over here to the right. So the user is just going to think there's Wi-Fi problems, try to keep connecting. Sucks for them if they're still by my Wi-Fi access point, because it's going to connect to whoever's the closest. But we can now start trying to crack this user hash. And we can see that MS Chat v2 authentication come across here. So as we expected, our Windows device used that authentication method when connecting to the network. Another one I want to show you really quick. I will connect to the network as well using my phone. So you won't be able to see the prompt whenever I connect to it, but I'm essentially getting the same prompts as I did on my Windows box when connecting. So you can see traffic happening over there. I get the same thing. The certificate pops up. I hit trust, and we see the GTC authentication come across. And as we expect, we have clear text usernames and passwords. So from here, if post-exploitation is in scope, you can start taking clear text credentials and logging into any kind of portals, maybe connecting to the network yourself. One thing to note with this MS Chat v2 authentication, since most of the time this is going to be tied to Windows devices, more likely than not, this is also going to be tied to their Active Directory credentials, which in this case it is for this user here. And so if we're able to take this password and try to crack it, we can now potentially have Active Directory user credentials for somebody on our target network. So I mean, from there, opportunities are kind of endless depending on what's all in scope. So you can start logging into, again, Office 365, maybe going onto the internal network, start doing lateral movement, privilege escalation, and things like that. So go ahead and close that out. How do I get back to? All right, so understanding the insecurity of these wireless configurations, both with WPA personal, or WPA and WPA2 personal, with the use of a pre-shared key or password. This configuration is vulnerable to brute force dictionary attacks. And again, you also have a shared password for authentication. So just many people having that password is more likely going to be the case, just because that's the only way to authenticate to those types of networks. WPA3 does kind of make that attack a little bit harder, but again, it is still possible, and there's other attacks that can still be done with evil twin attacks as well. With WPA and WPA2 Enterprise, use of radius server with those EAP methods, if certificates aren't enforced on both the client and the server side, these certificates can be spoofed, like we just saw in the demo, and be vulnerable to a man-in-the-middle attack, which can allow an attacker to intercept these credentials through that fake access point. So some takeaways with WPA, WPA2 and using a password. If a pre-shared key must be used, ensure that the password is at least 12 plus characters and isn't easily guessable. Still keeping things as like summer 2021 or doubling the year. I've seen a lot of people doing that to just up the character count. It's still pretty easy to guess those passwords. And also rotate the password regularly and at a minimum when employees leave. There's been so many times where you can see the password is summer 2011. I'm like, I wonder when they set the password for this wireless network, right? So like if you're not changing it often, these people who now leave your organization can still have network access to connect to your assets. And again, as I mentioned, you can upgrade to WPA3, which reduces the chances of a successful brute force attack. And with WPA2 Enterprise, ideally you want to use EAP TLS, that configuration enforces certificates on both the client and the server side. And this makes it where that it's not vulnerable to a man-in-the-middle attack. You can also add support for wireless intrusion prevention systems to help detect rogue access points if EAP TLS is just too hard for your organization or just configuration to roll out yourself. And then another recommendation is to disable those auto connect and auto join features on client devices, as those devices just all the time are just looking for networks that are already known or trusted. So if an attacker is setting up like a Starbucks network or something else like that probably a lot of people have connected to before, your device can connect to these rogue access points without even knowing it, or the user won't know it on their side. Here are some of the references and sources I used throughout the talk for some of the pictures and blogs that I referenced for some of the material. But yeah, if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to take those now.